Welcome, Deepa.
And it's fantastic to hear Tim, Kush, and Huda speak, and I'm looking forward to hearing Tony. For those of you who are not aware, I have been the legal observer in Julian Assange's case for just over 4 years, since he's been in Belmarsh prison. And outside of this, my day job is as a trade unionist and academic. I was quite moved by some of the things that people were saying here, and the courage that people have. And it is this courage that, you know, seems to be really what the state cannot bear. And this courage is contagious, because it is in conversations like these that we begin to realize that these are not solitary actions taking place. These are actions which deserve our solidarity and where we must come together even more. And one of those cases, which is really at a crucial point right now, is the case of Julian Assange. We are talking about the jury process, but one of the big problems with the case of Julian Assange is he's never had the right to a jury so far. So essentially, the extradition process, extradition law, has been misused by the Americans in order that in Britain, they don't have to prove either beyond reasonable doubt or on the balance of probabilities that Julian has committed a crime. And that crime, of course, is the crime of journalism as far as the US is concerned, because if you look at the indictment, the second superseding indictment the United States has laid on Julian's door, they are expecting him to serve 175 years. That is, I mean, you can call it a life sentence, you can also call it a death sentence, in a US supermax prison, where he will be held in a cell which is 8 by 10 and fed through a hatch in the door. The cell is made of concrete, and you can potentially talk to your prisoners in neighboring cells through the drains. And people drive themselves mad by doing so, and through the solitariness of what the situation entails. So what Julian is facing is a very, very, very extreme prison sentence for obtaining, receiving, and publishing classified information. What was this classified information? It was evidence of serious war crimes, killings, rapes, murders, tortures in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's also evidence of the inhumane and brutal torture of close to 780 Muslim men and boys as young as 14. The youngest prisoner in Guantanamo was well, not a prisoner, but a child who had been brought, was 3 months old. For revealing the fact that this happened, Julian is being punished. Julian is also, one of the charges, which is the smallest charge, is one which is, or rather one of the small charges, is one of a 5-year sentence, which is conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. Now, knowing Julian as a brilliant information technologist, people may assume that this is a hacking charge, and this is part of the kind of smearing that the US has been very good at. But it is not. What is it about? It's about a conversation that somebody with the initials NF had with Chelsea Manning, where they said, "Curious eyes never run dry," and where Chelsea Manning asked for help to cover up her tracks in relation to something. Now, this conversation, they have no proof that it was Julian Assange at the other end, but they are basing their allegations on the testimony of a serial convicted pedophile and fraudster, who, to his credit, has admitted in the public domain that this evidence was fabricated at the behest of the FBI. So this kind of rigged case is what Julian is facing in the United States. And pre-trial detention conditions are the supermax conditions that I told you about, but these conditions are determined by the FBI and the CIA. And why is there a problem with the CIA and the FBI determining his pre-trial detention? Well, it's because they plotted to assassinate him while he was within a sovereign embassy, that is the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And in all this time, we've had this juryless process going through, this jury-free process going through as an extradition process. What kinds of judges have we had? One, we've had Lady Emma Arbuthnot, wife of former Defence Minister James Arbuthnot, who clearly has a conflict of interest on account of his close connections with the intelligence services, but also has a potential conflict of interest as a result of her son's investments in a company called Dark Trace, which militates against organizations like WikiLeaks, and who has, according to, and none of this information is mine, according to Declassified UK, has herself received hospitality from those hostile to Assange. And this is somebody who's presided over the entire early extradition process and in fact been involved in 2 of the judgments that were made against Assange. Julian has served for 4 years for a crime he hasn't committed. He is not, I mean, he's still on remand. And it is his birthday on the 3rd of July, and I urge all of you to join in celebration with the various groups around the country. But it's also important to know that this case is also rigged, because the privileged legal conversations that Julian had with his lawyers, and in fact with his doctors and with his friends, were systematically surveilled. We now have evidence which has come out in the last week or so, published by El País, from the Spanish case which has been going on, which shows that the Spanish police didn't release to the judge evidence of a file, which is about however many 100 gig, showing a folder which said for the CIA. And these are the privileged conversations that Julian has had with Gareth Pierce, with Aitor Martinez, with all his lawyers. And finally, you know, the whole court process, I've queued at 3 or 4 a.m. and colleagues, friends and supporters have queued because we were not allowed into court. 40 human rights organizations who had previously been granted access at the Old Bailey had their access removed on the first day of the hearings. But for those of us who stayed and said, okay, we will queue and go into the public gallery, there were 96 seats across the 2 courtrooms. And yet only 2 seats were allowed first thing in the morning for the public, so to speak. So you had to queue for one of those 2 seats. And I mean, 2-meter distance for COVID, for Christ's sake, I mean, how far do you have to be to have only 2 people allowed? But you go in there and they treat you with so much disdain. You have this 80-year-old odd man, Julian's father, climbing up 5 flights of stairs. You know, you have Craig Murray with his heart condition trying to report the hearings, you know, going in with the family as one of the family invitees. And they don't allow you to take in water. You cannot, they say that if they told me on one of the days of the hearings that I could take, as the legal observer, I could take in pen and paper, but I could not write. And Julian himself, when he was moved from Belmarsh prison to come to court, was strip searched twice, moved from cell to cell 5 times, handcuffed, brought to court in the equivalent of an upright coffin. You know, that's what these Serco type vehicles are like. And all of this is part of the dehumanization of a journalist and publisher, while Tony Blair and the war criminals like George Bush are standing, being feted by the British state, which is, you know, glad to be complicit in the imperialist oppression of people, in the destruction of lives in other parts of the world, and then complain about refugees from places where they have destroyed people's livelihoods and completely removed any possibility of people to have a decent life. They don't want to come here. Nobody wants to come here at such great cost. It's only because we are killing people all over the world that this is happening. And it is really important that if we care about refugees, if we care about climate justice, WikiLeaks has published so much. For example, they publish information about toxic waste dumping by Trafigura off the Ivory Coast. It's not just war crimes that WikiLeaks has published. And they've been able to publish this, not just because of the courage and intelligence of Julian Assange and the people at WikiLeaks. It's because of the courage and intelligence of the whistleblowers within these organizations who believe in the true processes of these organizations, not the made up processes by management, but the true processes that in terms of what these organizations should be doing in these other countries, what is decent, and these people who are upholding the law have released this information because they can see that the law is being trampled upon. And so we must protect both whistleblowers and journalists like Assange if we want to know what happens when you have a relative in a care home, what happens when you have a brother in prison, what happens when you have a sister living in Libya. If you want to know the truth about what happens to them, we have to protect WikiLeaks and Assange. And, you know, the misuse, and I'll end here, Tina, just a few, a couple of small points, which are, the law is being used not as an instrument of justice, but as an instrument of injustice. And the fact that British judges and British lawyers are not speaking up against this kind of blatant misuse of the law is something that we need to be deeply concerned about. There is an obstruction and arbitrariness in the state responses to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions, multiple findings, at least 2 findings, that Julian has been arbitrarily detained. A complete disdain that Julian has been tortured. There are blatant breaches of due process rights, and all the protections that the law affords in relation to extradition have been ignored, as well as, you know, there's been a complete denial of resources. To take away a man's glasses and not allow him to prepare for trial while he's having 175 years in a prison, not allow him to talk to his lawyers, and to have a selective prosecution and a disproportionate sentence is not something we should be allowing, because it's not just Julian Assange. What they do to Assange is the start of what they do to the rest of us. So it is really important we should speak up, and I'll stop there. And I thank you very much for allowing me to speak.